how I normally do. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. The idea, so I'll just start by distinguishing ideal from non-ideal epistemology, right? So it's really tricky to know how precisely to distinguish these. There are various kinds of sociological trends associated with the different forms, but I don't think a lot of these are necessary or sufficient. So for non-ideal epistemology, it tends to be fairly informal and not particularly mathy, whereas ideal epistemology tends to be more formal, tends to be more mathy. Non-ideal epistemology tends to talk about beliefs more, whereas ideal epistemology tends to talk about credences more, although again, lots of exceptions to this. Non-ideal epistemology tends to use the term justified, whereas ideal epistemology tends to use the term rational. Non-ideal epistemology often involves talk of reasons, whereas that's not really common in ideal epistemology. Non-ideal epistemology often focuses on a relation between, say, justification and knowledge, whereas ideal epistemology tends to talk about the relation between epistemology and decision theory. Non-ideal epistemology often talks about babies and puppies. Ideal epistemology often talks about super babies. Non-ideal epistemologists tend to write in Word, ideal epistemologists tend to write in LaTeX, and so on and so on. Ideal epistemology often looks a little bit mathy, right? Lots of notation. Now, okay, so let me just say I am finding it a little disorienting not to see people's faces, so this is a little different from what I'm used to, but whatever. All right, okay. Also my internet tends to freeze, but because I can't see your faces, then I'm not going to be able to tell whether I'm frozen. So just interrupt me at some point if I have frozen. I'm now unfrozen and I need to repeat something. Right, sorry. Okay. Sorry. All right. So I think of these two areas not as kind of views, but rather as sets of questions. Right. So I think ideal epistemologists are concerned with questions roughly about what perfectly rational, cognitively idealized, computationally unlimited, fictional believers would believe, in very loose sense of believe, to include credences and whatnot. Whereas non-ideal epistemologists, I think, are concerned with questions about epistemic norms that are satisfiable by most humans most of the time. And so, yeah, ideal epistemology will often presuppose or defend various kinds of epistemic norms that no humans can, in fact, satisfy, arguably at least. So things like closure of binary beliefs under logical entailment, logical omniscience, infinitely precise degrees of belief, et cetera, conditionalization involving, say, immediate update on evidence without information loss. And so often people respond to this with variations on the theme of an incredulous stare. They suggest, like, why should we even be talking about these kinds of questions? This is a kind of challenge that I feel like I hear most often in discussion after talks. Why really are we even talking about this ideal epistemology kinds of stuff rather than in literature as written by working epistemologists? But it does come up a lot, and that's why originally I wrote this paper, the paper that this talk is based on. So the aim here is to provide some kind of justification for why ideal epistemology is a valuable pursuit, not to the exclusion of non-ideal epistemology. I think they work well together, but instead to answer the question why ideal epistemology is worth doing at all. And so the claim is going to be that only ideal epistemic evaluations are going to be, in an important sense, normatively robust. So this is a term of art that I'm introducing. An evaluation is normatively robust just in case it is not conventional and it's not seriously context sensitive. I'm going to characterize what I mean by conventional and seriously context sensitive a little later on, but that gives you a loose sense of what I'm talking about when I say that they're normatively robust. Whereas non-ideal epistemic evaluations are not going to be normatively robust. They're going to depend not just on considerations about what's epistemically valuable and how one can effectively pursue it, but also on various kinds of contingent features, in particular modally contingent epistemic conventions and contextually contingent constraints on what counts as being feasible, what one can do. And so the value of ideal epistemology is going to be in supplying a kind of normatively robust epistemic theory. Okay. So let's set this up a little bit, right? So this is obviously a metaepistemology talk, and my approach to it is going to be partly in philosophy of language. And so I just want to rehearse a kind of orthodox theory of normative language, of things like oughts, talking about ought in very loose sense. So this is shorthand for various forms of evaluation, some involving actual modal auxiliaries like ought, and some involving good, justified, and so on. Right, but all of these are, on the orthodox view, very context sensitive, and they're context sensitive in a few different kinds of ways. So they're sensitive partly to contextually salient sets of norms, where these sets of norms will function to determine an ordering over possibilities in terms of how epistemically good different possible worlds are, right? And so often this notion, sets of norms in the literature, in Kratzer's semantics for modals, this is going to be called the ordering source, but I just need for it to be something that determines an ordering over possibilities. And then this semantics is also sensitive to what I'm here calling circumstantial background. The circumstantial background just says there's going to be some contextually salient circumstances that one holds fixed for the purposes of the evaluation. So we treat these as constraints on what counts as possible for the purposes of, say, ought implies can. And this is sometimes called the modal base. All right, so how does this look? So, okay, suppose here's logical space, here's our space of possible worlds. Our set of norms determines an ordering over these possible worlds. In this diagram, higher up worlds are better worlds in the ordering. And then the circumstantial background determines some set of possible worlds that are compatible with whatever circumstances are being held fixed. So this in part does something like giving the semantics for can, right? What can happen. It's what's consistent with the circumstances that we're holding fixed. And then, so when we give evaluations like ought phi, these are treated as quantifiers of our possible worlds, where when ought to phi, just in case phi is true at all of the highest ranked worlds compatible with the circumstances. So all the worlds in this little section. So compatible with the circumstances, but highest ranked. Okay, so that's a real cartoon version of Kratzer semantics, but that's the idea. Okay. So now it seems like ideal epistemologists are giving one kind of epistemic evaluation and non-ideal epistemologists are giving another kind of epistemic evaluation. So I might think maybe this suggests that epistemic ought is ambiguous, like if both of them are not merely wrong, then so you might think that it's ambiguous, that's ideal and non-ideal epistemologists are just discussing different topics where, one is giving evaluations of rationality for idealized believers, whereas other are giving kind of a notion of reasonability for us ordinary non-idealized believers. And my view is that there isn't in fact ambiguity here. So I think that ideal and non-ideal epistemic oughts have a unified semantics. That's fairly cheap. I also think they have at least a partly unified post-semantics. So they're not in disagreement with each other, but they're not talking past each other. So what does this mean? So ideal and non-ideal epistemic oughts, on my view, use the very same ordering over possibilities. Where they differ is just in their circumstantial backgrounds and what circumstances they're treating as fixed for the purposes of epistemic evaluation. So non-ideal epistemic ought treats the contextually salient circumstances as including some of the relevant believers' cognitive limitations. So they treat those as just fixed circumstances. And whereas I think that ideal epistemic oughts don't treat believers' cognitive limitations as fixed circumstances in the same kinds of ways. So they're comes to be this kind of convergence between the ideal and non-ideal epistemic odds. Once we pare down different cognitive limitations, right, then they end up converging with each other. So the picture that emerges here then is there's the difference between ideal and non-ideal epistemology is that non-ideal epistemology involves looking at epistemic evaluations that use a kind of substantive ought implies can constraint, right? And I say substantive here because I mean that the relevant can for ought implies can here is stronger than mere metaphysical possibility. And I think ideal epistemology kind of doesn't. There isn't this kind of substantive ought implies can constraint. Cognitive limitations of various kinds are not going to, in fact, be held fixed among circumstances. Okay, so that's the picture of the difference between the two. Now, I want to argue that non-ideal epistemic norms are non-robust. They're not robust, normatively robust. So let's say what normative robustness is. So, okay, an evaluation is normatively robust just in case it's both non-conventional and not seriously context sensitive. So non-conventional isn't the form of convention. So when I talk about conventions here, I just mean something like regularities in behavior, in some very loose sense of behavior that serve some kind of coordinative function and that are such that there's some alternative regularity in behavior that would have served the same coordinative function just as well, right? So this is not as strong a notion of convention as, for example, Lewis's. These need not be socially generated. They could be, for example, evolutionarily generated and following Doromaje here. Okay, so that's the notion of convention on the table. What about serious context sensitivity? So this also is a term of art that I'm introducing here. So on my usage, a kind of evaluation is seriously context sensitive just in case there's no normatively privileged resolution of the contextual parameters of evaluations of that kind. So what do I mean here? Well, my inclination is to think that, for example, when different moral philosophers are providing their different kinds of moral evaluations, even if they endorse different normative theories from each other, I think they still count as possibly disagreeing with each other, which means that the relevant kinds of norms for the oughts that they're using for their evaluations, those norms aren't just whatever norms each individual happens to endorse. Those aren't the ones determining the relevant ordering. Rather, what determines the relevant ordering is normatively privileged. So it's the moral truths in the sky, right? Those determine what the relevant ordering is. And I think that speakers intend to be giving evaluations that faithfully represent that ordering. And at most one of them is going to be right in cases of disagreement. So when I say that a kind of evaluation is seriously context sensitive, I'm saying there isn't something like the actual moral truths in the sky that provide a kind of normatively privileged resolution of the, say, the ordering or also the fixed circumstances. Okay. So, right, so my claim is that the non-ideal epistemic ought is not normatively robust. And it's not normatively robust for a bunch of different reasons and from a bunch of different sources. So first, I think the non-ideal part of the ordering, as you move below the ideal, once you move below the pinnacle, the non-ideal part of the ordering is at least partly conventional, which makes it modally contingent. And I also think that there isn't any normatively privileged set of cognitive limitations that ought to be held fixed within the circumstantial background. And so there's also serious context sensitivity in non-ideal epistemic evaluations, which is to say that they're not just modally contingent, but also contextually contingent. Okay, so there are going to be multiple different sources then of non-robustness, and I'm going to argue for each of these claims here. All right, so first I want to argue that the orderings are non-robust. Okay, to do this, I'm going to introduce a really kind of simplified picture of how epistemic evaluations work and what they're for. So on this picture, the ultimate epistemic end is true belief or accurate credence, etc. And rationality, epistemic rationality, that is a kind of means to this end. And I'll just quietly flag that I don't exactly endorse this picture, but I think it's close enough to being correct for present purposes. Okay, so what means are there to achieving our ultimate epistemic end of having true beliefs or accurate credences? One means is to adopt truth-conducive epistemic rules. So, ways of responding to one's evidence, for example. And another is to just find ways of improving one's epistemic situation. So that might involve developing various kinds of tools that allow one to collect information to serve as input for one's epistemic rules. Now, one of the perhaps most important tools for acquiring information to serve as input to your epistemic rules is other people. Other people are often a source of evidence for us. So if this hinges on certain kinds of factors, right? So we often rely on others' testimony for information. A lot of our beliefs are based on testimony. And if other people endorse epistemic standards or update in accordance with epistemic standards that are truth conducive, then trusting those other people is truth conducive, right? And so this picture suggests that the purpose of epistemic evaluation is ultimately to encourage others to adopt truth-conducive epistemic rules. And so I think this kind of picture of epistemic evaluation is defended in Dora Maja. It's also defended, I think, in Greco and Hedden, and I think in joint work by Dora Maja and Horowitz. All right, let's see. Okay, so that's the kind of basic background picture. Now, suppose that's the picture we have, right? And suppose you want to maximize, why did I put this? This looking interesting. Okay, so, all right, sorry, my slides are a little bit confusing. All right, so suppose you want to be able to trust other people's, what is going on here? Oh, okay, I think these are in the wrong order. Okay, sorry, these are in the wrong order. Okay. Okay, no, all right. Sorry, I think there's something wrong with these slides. Anyway, okay, so, all right. So what we don't want to claim that our goal is to, that, the relevant kinds of evaluations are just going to require us to be omniscient. So instead, when we're talking about trying to achieve our goals, we're really looking for trying to improve our truth conducivity. Here, when I talk about truth conducivity, I'm thinking of this in terms of something like expected accuracy. So this is going to be a notion that is kind of relativized to one's point of view, right? Expectations are probability function relative, right? So now a problem then arises, which is that if we're trying to evaluate different kinds of epistemic rules, we're trying to achieve this end of, say, adopting the truth-conducive epistemic rules, well, there are going to be ties between sets of epistemic rules that seem to have an equal claim to truth conducivity in the sense that, they each, say, maximize expected accuracy from their own perspective, right? And these epistemic rules that are tied are not compatible with each other. You can't embrace all of them at the same time, right? And so we cannot adopt all of the truth-conducive epistemic rules. Okay, so one might think, all right, so insofar as that's true, what we really need to do then is to adopt some maximal set of consistent truth-conducive epistemic rules or epistemic standards, right? Just adopt one of the ones that's tied for best. But unfortunately, there's more than one, because there's more than one tied maximal set, it's not clear that if we just each individually adopt some maximal set, that we're going to be able to serve the kind of coordinative function that is useful for, that epistemic evaluations are useful for, namely making it the case that trusting other people is truth conducive, right? Because if I expect other people to be truth conducive, then then it makes sense for me to update on their testimony. But if I think that they use epistemic standards that aren't truth conducive from my perspective, that is, that don't maximize expected accuracy from my perspective, then I should think they're not truth conducive, and so I shouldn't update on their testimony, or I shouldn't update on it faithfully. I shouldn't trust them, right? So in order for us to feel comfortable trusting each other, it looks like we're going to need to coordinate in our epistemic standards. We need to have shared epistemic standards, right? All right, sorry, I just said all of this. Okay, so it looks like we're, if there's all these different epistemic standards that are tied in terms of their claim to truth conducivity, but we need to share epistemic standards in order to be able to make use of each other as sources of information, then it looks like we're just going to need to select one of the objectively tied standards, and that selection is going to be arbitrary from the point of view of accuracy. All right, so, sorry, that was a little odd. Okay, so that was the first source of non-robustness. It looks like we're just going to have to take, arbitrarily select one of the tied set of epistemic standards. Okay. Second set. So you might think, all right, so we're going to take one of them. Suppose, if we're looking at some kind of optimally truth conducive epistemic standards, or one of the tied ones, well, all of the maximal consistent sets of truth conducive epistemic standards are going to include all valid epistemic rules, right? But there's this problem, which is that for the purposes of non-ideal epistemology, we're aiming to respect some kind of substantive ought implies can principle. But in the relevant sense of can, ordinary believers cannot adopt all of the infinitely many valid epistemic rules, right? At best, we can adopt small subsets that are as powerful as possible. But which small sets should we be adopting? There are going to be multiple small, powerful subsets that are equally truth conducive, and we're going to need to select one among the many. And from the point of view of truth conducivity, again, this selection is going to be arbitrary. So this is something that Doramaja has argued. As an example, this example here comes from Doramaja, calling this fictional Fermat. So fictional Fermat has the following inference for Fermat's last theorem. So take some standard axioms of arithmetic, and from here he immediately infers Fermat's last theorem with no intermediary steps, right? Just immediately infers Fermat's last theorem. Oh, sorry, I said that this was from Doramaja. Doramaja actually attributes this to Boghossian. Okay, so a common intuition is that this inference is not, for the purposes of non-ideal epistemology, this is not a rational inference. But then we should ask, why isn't it a rational inference? And there are plenty of stories one could tell, but a possible explanation is just that, look, of the infinite number of valid inference rules, we ordinarily only accept a few as capable of rationalizing belief. And this inference pattern here, this inference rule, is not among those that we have accepted as capable of rationalizing belief. Right? So this suggests then that there could be cases where an inference that is in fact truth preserving is nevertheless, for the purposes of non-ideal epistemology, treated as not capable of producing rational belief. Okay, so third source of non-robustness. So the first two sources both suggested that there's some conventionality in the selection of the relevant epistemic rules. Now, another source of conventionalities and arbitrariness here is the following. So if we are using a large arbitrary set of rules, it can be pretty hard to establish a convention. And I don't just mean as something that we do socially, although of course that's true socially. It's also going to be true if these conventions are the result of something like natural selection, right? So consider universal grammar, right? Sometimes people talk about universal grammar as though we have language innately. And there's a sense in which the theory of universal grammar suggests that we have language innately, but really it says that we have like a kind of template for language innately. But we don't have complete languages innately. We didn't evolve a total shared innate language. That's why we have to learn language and we speak different languages from each other and so on. And one might think like, the purposes of language would have been better served if we had, in fact, evolved such that we just immediately knew a complete shared language that everyone could speak. But that's a really hard kind of convention to establish. An easier kind of convention to establish would be to get some of the rules in there, rules associated with syntax and so on. And then maybe other kinds of things can come in at the convention level later, locally, right? So if we are trying to, so the first two considerations for conventionality just looked at individuals, and it said, look, individuals can't adopt all truth-conducive epistemic standards, so they've got to arbitrarily choose among those tied for most truth-conducive, and then we suggested they can't individually have, say, all of the valid inference rules within their epistemic standards. So those, instead we narrow down the set of valid inference rules that are included in epistemic standards. Now, the suggestion is, once we're trying to establish a convention across people, this generates extra pressure to exclude even more epistemic rules as capable of rationalizing belief, right? In order to make it the case that across people we can coordinate on a shared set of epistemic standards. And so this introduces yet more arbitrariness. Okay. So, all right, so considerations of ought implies can, coordination, and so on. These all require some kind of conventionality in our selection of a small, powerful set of epistemic rules to coordinate on, right? Where this will involve ruling out some truth-conducive epistemic rules as irrational. And so the norms that are relevant for determining the ordering, that's the non-ideal part of the ordering, are going to be conventional and hence normatively non-robust. Now, because of this conventionality, people like Doro Mudja conclude there's no possible theory of epistemic rationality. And I think that conclusion is a little too hasty because, as you might notice, in ideal epistemology, there's really not a barrier to adopting all valid epistemic rules. And so you might think there's no reason for conventionality here. It's a little more complicated than that. We can talk about that later on if people are interested, but that's the idea. Okay, so I've suggested that for the purposes of non-ideal epistemic evaluations, the relevant ordering is conventional. Now, the other context-sensitive part of the evaluations is going to be the relevant fixed circumstances, that is the circumstantial background. And I'm going to argue that this too is non-robust. So there's different sources of non-robustness here as well. All right, I just said that. So on this view, I think the determination of the circumstantial background is going to be either conventional or seriously context sensitive, or perhaps both, right? But the idea is something like this. There's no normatively privileged set of cognitive limitations that determine what we can do, and that therefore constrain what we ought to do. So I'd suggested that non-ideal epistemic evaluations involve a kind of substantive ought implies can, right? If there's no normatively privileged can, then there isn't a normatively privileged resolution for the circumstantial background for the ought. All right. So to explain what I mean here, it's worth talking a little bit more just about this notion of can, the circumstantial can, right? So this is really one of the least understood and least researched forms of modality in natural language. To say, can phi, that's true just in case phi is compatible with some contextually salient circumstances on the kind of orthodox semantics. But which circumstances are contextually salient and which ones therefore are held fixed for the purposes of circumstantial can, it's just something that's extraordinarily flexible, apparently more so than for various other kinds of modals, right? So as an example, consider the following sentence. I physically, here we're talking about physically can. I physically can grasp my ankles from a standing backbend. Consider that claim, right? So it's justification for this. Unlike some people say, well, suppose my skeletal structure will permit it, I would just need to do regular stretches for a few years, right? So I'm in the lucky group of people who can grasp their ankles from a standing backbend. Now, consider another sentence. I physically cannot grasp my ankles from a standing backbend, right? For, as justification, if I tried right now, then I would pull all of my muscles and fall on my face and whatnot, right? So both of these are, as far as I can tell, true, right? It just depends on whether we're holding fixed, say, the state of my muscles or not holding fixed the state of my muscles, right? So I think because the state of my muscles is not this important and privileged thing in philosophy of language in general, this is suggestive of just how much flexibility there can be in terms of what circumstances are held fixed. This is just variation on the theme of an example from David Lewis, if you are familiar with his famous I can't speak Finnish example. Yeah. Okay. So now there's this question then, is there a normatively privileged, contextually invariant can that is entailed by the ought of epistemic rationality, right? So consider the following. There are various kinds of cognitive limitations that we standardly treat as loosening the requirements of non-ideal rationality, right? As lowering the bar for what it takes to count as rational in the non-ideal sense. So these include things like our limited computational power, limitations on our information storage and processing speeds, and so on and so on, limitations on our lifespan, right? But there are other kinds of cognitive limitations that we don't treat as loosening the requirements of non-ideal rationality. Rather, we treat these as instead cognitive limitations that cause us to be irrational. So these include things like our disposition toward implicit biases, or our disposition towards use of unreliable heuristics, various kinds of delusional reasoning, inflated sense of your own driving ability, over-optimism, pessimism, etc., overestimating the moral superiority of your own side in a fight with a spouse, blah, 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 right? These are various kinds of cognitive limitations that are pretty widespread, but that we don't treat as lowering the bar for what counts as rational. We don't treat these as rational. Instead, we treat these as sources of irrationality. So then the question arises, why is it that some cognitive limitations lower the bar, for rationality, whereas others constitute irrationality? And so I think that the explanation is going to involve some form of normative non-robustness, right? So this is source number 4 of normative non-robustness. But I'm not sure what the answer would be. It could be conventionality, right? So it might be that it's just a convention where we draw the line between these two kinds of cognitive limitations, right? So maybe, given that we can't continually, conscientiously mitigate the damage of all of these different kinds of cognitive imperfections, it would make sense to have some kinds of conventions for determining which ones to try to mitigate, right? This would help make epistemic evaluations more predictable, and so it would help make them more efficacious. And so maybe the line is purely a matter of convention. Alternatively, maybe there's serious context sensitivity here, right? So, I think this line here seems to exist amongst us epistemologists, in our classrooms and so on. But it might be that this is a kind of artifact of us theorizing about this in ways that presuppose that it's more normatively robust than it in fact is. And I think it's quite possible that once we look at actual epistemic evaluations in the wild, we'll see that, in fact, this is more context sensitive than we might give it credit for. So it seems like one can talk about, for example, what's rational given one's, say, inflated estimate of their driving skills or something like that. Rational given one's delusions. In which case, maybe there's serious context sensitivity here. So that's source number 4 of normative non-robustness. Oh, I should say these are also consistent with each other, so it could be both. I think there's also a 5th source of normative non-robustness here. So it seems to me that the can that is at least used by traditional non-ideal epistemologists, so the can implied by traditional non-ideal epistemic ought, is not sensitive to individual variations in ability, right? So it doesn't care whether somebody has, say, a brain lesion that causes them to have certain kinds of delusions. It just will say that they are irrational for having those kinds of delusions, that even though that is a source of cognitive limitation. And I think the kind of picture that I provided of the purpose of epistemic evaluations would predict this, right? So coordination and epistemic standards is the kind of thing that's easier to achieve in our evaluations. If those evaluations aren't going to depend on the idiosyncratic psychological features of individual believers that evaluators might not be in a position to know about. But I have an intuition, and I invite you to share it with me, which is that if there's a normatively privileged can for the purposes of epistemic ought implies can, it would be sensitive to individual variations in ability. And to kind of bolster this intuition, consider ethics, right? In ethical evaluation, it's clear that we treat ought implies can as sensitive to what different individuals can do, right? That different individuals have different abilities, right? So one might say Jeff Bezos ought to donate $100 billion to charity. It's not the case that you personally ought to donate $100 billion to charity. And the reason why it's not the case that you ought to do it is one of the things that you cannot, right? Right. So you have different abilities from Jeff Bezos. He can, and therefore he ought. And so I think that whatever the normatively privileged can for in the epistemic cases, it too should be sensitive to these kinds of individual variations and abilities, if it is in fact normatively privileged. But I don't think that there is a normatively privileged can, in part because it seems like the relevant can for non-ideal evaluations seems not, in fact, to be sensitive to individual variation and ability. Okay. So upshot here then is that's the relevant can for the non-ideal epistemic ought. It draws a kind of boundary between cognitive limitations that loosen the requirements of rationality versus those that constitute irrationality. And I think this boundary is conventional or seriously context sensitive or both, so it too is normatively non-robust. Okay, so much said about non-ideal epistemology. What about ideal epistemology, right? So I said that there are these 5 different sources of normative non-robustness in non-ideal epistemic evaluations. What if we want a normatively robust form of epistemic evaluation? I think that if this exists, it's in the ideal epistemic ought, right? The various sources of non-robustness for the ideal epistemic ought seem not to apply here. And it does seem like there are unifying theories for ideal epistemology. Right? So, okay. Now one might ask, why would we want a normatively robust theory? Why does normative robustness matter? So one kind of answer is to say, look, if you like a certain kind of metaphysics, then you can think of the normatively robust evaluations as the ones that latch onto normatively fundamental properties, right? Where things like conventions are not normatively fundamental. They're going to depend on various kinds of historical contingencies. And if there are these kind of normatively fundamental properties, then they're the kinds of things that ought to be expressible with language that isn't seriously context sensitive. They're going to be such that there are evaluations that can latch onto them as the normatively privileged sources of norms. Okay. So you don't necessarily have to go in for that kind of metaphysics. I think in general, only normatively robust properties, normatively robust kinds of evaluations are going to be amenable to a priori predictive epistemic theorizing. If you give up on the normatively robust sense, either going to be not a priori or not predictive, depending on just how kind of schematic it's left as being. Okay, so I've suggested that non-ideal epistemology is not normatively robust. I do not intend for this to be an objection to non-ideal epistemology. Right, this isn't a problem. But it does suggest a kind of role for ideal epistemology. So I think, in contrast to many others, that we could treat non-ideal epistemology as involving a characterization of approximation of ideal epistemic ideality as described by ideal epistemology. So ordinary believers approximate ideal rationality to greater or lesser degrees. Crucially, though, the relevant form of approximation happens in convention-governed ways. The relevant ordering is convention-governed. And ordinary believers are held back or excused by our cognitive limitations, where whether we count as being held back or count as being excused depends on context. So a kind of full epistemological theory on this view would involve a few different components. So first, we'd need a characterization of the relevant kind of normatively fundamental factors, where on the picture I've given, this would involve a characterization of which epistemic rules are truth conducive or ideal, in whatever sense of ideal we have. It would also involve a characterization of certain kinds of contingent empirical factors, where here we would look at something like a more kind of psychologically sophisticated understanding of the cognitive limitations that humans in fact have, where this would look also to variations in the different cognitive limitations of different individuals, right? But here, we're looking at various kinds of psychological factors. We would also need this third component, which is some characterization of the resolution of the relevant non-robust factors. So part of this might involve looking at sociological or evolutionary, or both, kinds of facts about what epistemic conventions we happen to have settled on. And it would also involve looking at sociological and perhaps linguistic facts about which cognitive limitations are treated, perhaps in context, as loosening the requirements for rationality versus, for example, constituting irrationality, where this might be a matter of convention or a matter of just context sensitivity. Right, so this will give us our kind of total non-ideal epistemology, but this uses as input ideal epistemology. Ideal epistemology does this first task of characterizing the ideal, truth-conducive epistemic rules. Okay, so wrapping up, so ideal epistemology kind of offers a theory of the normatively robust in epistemology. If we pair it up with empirical facts about, say, our cognitive limitations, our epistemic conventions, context sensitivity of our expressions, and so on, this gives us the best shot of explaining why, how, and in what context we will settle for merely approximating the ideal.